The first thing is that these children are being raised in some type of freak show. It's like they are Michael Jackson's children who were paraded to the world but
Hung
covered
down
up in
outside the
masks.
window.
Yeah, but then remember, he covered their identities.
There is a photograph that most people have never seen. Not because it was hidden deliberately, not because anyone suppressed it, but because it existed in the quiet margin of a much louder story. The kind of detail that sits in plain sight until someone with the right background and the right sources points directly at it and says, "Look more carefully at what is actually there." Angela Levin pointed at it, and what she says she found underneath has unsettled people on both sides of this debate in ways that the usual Sussex controversy simply does not manage to do. If you have followed this family story for any length of time, and many of you watching have followed it for years, some of you since long before Harry and Meghan were even a headline, you will know that most of what gets presented as shocking revelation turns out on closer examination to be familiar territory dressed in new language. The same arguments, the same fault lines, the same entrenched positions producing the same predictable responses. This feels different, and I want to take the time today to explain carefully and honestly why. If this is the kind of royal coverage you have been looking for, properly researched, fairly presented, and genuinely respectful of your intelligence, then I would warmly invite you to subscribe before we go any further. What we try to do here is get it right rather than get it loud, and today's story deserves that approach more than most. Angela Levin is not a figure who requires much introduction to anyone who has followed the House of Windsor closely. She is a royal biographer with decades of experience, the author of a biography of Prince Harry that drew on what she has described as significant personal access to him during a period before his relationship with Meghan became public. She is not a neutral observer. She has made her views on the direction of Harry's life abundantly clear over the years, but she is a serious one. Her knowledge of the institution, its internal culture, its unwritten rules, and its documented history is not easily dismissed even by those who disagree sharply with her conclusions. What she is now saying about Archie and Lilibet draws on that knowledge, and it draws on something else. Sources within and adjacent to the royal household whose accounts, she says, she has been gathering and cross-referencing for some time. The picture that emerges from those accounts is one that she describes as humiliating for Harry, not in the tabloid sense of that word, not as spectacle or scandal, but in the quieter, more enduring sense of a man discovering that the choices he made and the costs he paid for making them have produced consequences he did not anticipate and may not be equipped to manage. And this is the part that most people have missed. The specific details Levin is now sharing about Archie and Lilibet are not at their heart about the children. They concern the children in the sense that the children are the living consequence of a set of decisions made by their parents. Decisions about identity, about belonging, about what it means to claim royal heritage while simultaneously rejecting the institution that gives that heritage its meaning. Let's build this carefully because it deserves care. When Harry and Meghan left the royal family in early 2020 and eventually settled in California, they made a set of public statements about what they wanted for their children. Privacy, normalcy, a life free from the pressures and protocols that Harry has described with considerable anguish as having defined and damaged his own childhood. The desire to raise Archie and Lilibet differently than how Harry was raised, with more warmth, more freedom, more space to simply be children rather than symbols, was presented as one of the foundational justifications for the departure. That desire is entirely understandable. Any parent who has experienced a difficult childhood carries the instinct to protect their own children from repeating it. And Harry's account of his royal upbringing, the emotional distance, the institutional rigidity, the sense of being managed rather than loved, is an account that many people found deeply credible and genuinely moving. But here is where the story takes an unexpected turn. Angela Levin's new details concern what she describes as the growing gap between the vision Harry and Meghan articulated for their children's lives and the reality that is now taking shape. A gap that, according to her sources, is becoming visible in ways that are causing quiet but significant concern among people who know Harry well and who have watched this unfold from closer proximity than the public has been permitted to see. The first strand of what she is revealing concerns the question of identity. Archie and Lilibet are being raised in California as the children of a duke and a former actress turned humanitarian. They hold royal titles that were confirmed following the accession of King Charles. They are by every constitutional measure a prince and a princess of the United Kingdom, and they are growing up with, by all available accounts, essentially no lived connection to the country, the family, or the institution those titles represent. Now, Levin's argument, and it is important to frame it as argument rather than established fact, is that this disconnection is not the liberation it was presented as, that it is instead a form of deprivation. Not material deprivation, not emotional deprivation in the straightforward sense, but a deprivation of context, of history, of the connective tissue that links a person to the larger story they are part of, whether they choose to engage with that story or not. She has said in recent interviews that sources close to the royal family describe a situation where Archie and Lilibet are growing up without meaningful knowledge of their British heritage, without relationships with the family members who share their bloodline, and without any framework for understanding what their titles and their lineage actually mean, or will mean, when they are old enough to ask the questions that all children eventually ask about who they are and where they come from. What nobody talked about at the time is how unusual this situation is, even within the context of royal departures. The history of the British monarchy contains other estrangements, other departures, other moments where members of the royal family stepped back from or were pushed out of the active working structure of the institution. But in almost all of those cases, including the most dramatic, the abdication of Edward VIII, the children who came afterward were either raised within the system or were born outside it from the beginning. The situation of Archie and Lilibet is genuinely without precedent. They were born into the system, they were given titles by that system, and they are being raised in deliberate geographic and relational distance from it. The psychological literature on identity formation in children suggests that this kind of situation, straddling two worlds without full access to either, can create a particular kind of internal complexity. Not inevitably, not in every case, but with sufficient frequency that the concern Levin's sources are expressing is not without foundation in what developmental researchers understand about how children make sense of who they are. That is not a criticism of Harry and Meghan as parents. It is an honest observation about the unprecedented nature of the circumstances their children are navigating. And here is where the humiliation that Levin describes begins to take shape. Because the humiliation she is pointing to is not public embarrassment in the conventional sense. It is something more private and more painful than that. It is, according to her account, the experience of a man who made enormous sacrifices of relationship, of security, of institutional belonging in the name of protecting his children from the damage his own royal upbringing caused him, and who is now confronting the possibility that the protection he sought to provide has created its own form of complication that he did not fully anticipate. Harry left the royal family in significant part for Archie and Lilibet. That was the story he told. That was the justification he offered, most powerfully and most emotionally, in his memoir and in the Netflix documentary. The image of a father protecting his children from the institution that failed to protect him is the most sympathetic version of the Sussex departure, and it is the version that earned Harry the broadest public empathy. If Levin's sources are accurate, and we must hold that conditional carefully, then the reality of what that protection looks like in practice is more complicated than the image suggested. And the complication, sitting quietly beneath the public narrative, is something Harry is having to reckon with privately, as the public story remains largely intact. Let's talk about what Levin is specifically claiming about the children's current circumstances, because the details matter and they deserve to be reported accurately. She has described, drawing on her sources, a situation in which Archie and Lilibet have had minimal contact with the British side of their family over an extended period. The relationship between Harry and King Charles, which was already severely strained before Charles's cancer diagnosis, has not produced the reconciliation that many observers hoped the diagnosis might motivate. Whatever contact exists between the Sussex children and their grandfather, the king, is, by multiple accounts, limited in a way that Charles himself reportedly finds painful. The relationship between Harry and Prince William, the brothers whose bond was once described as one of the closest in the royal family, whose shared grief over Diana was a defining feature of both their public and private identities, has, by every credible account, remained effectively frozen, which means that Archie and Lilibet's cousins, George, Charlotte, and Louis, are children they have met rarely and do not know in any meaningful sense. That detail matters more than it first appears, because the loss of cousins is not a constitutional matter. It is not a question of titles or succession or institutional protocol. It is simply a human loss. The kind of ordinary family connection, the shared holidays, the easy familiarity of children who have grown up alongside each other, the natural warmth that comes from simply being in the same room with the same people repeatedly over time, that most families take for granted and that most children receive without anyone having to make a decision about it. Archie and Lilibet do not have that, not with this side of their family, and the decision to deprive them of it, however understandable the circumstances that produce that decision, is a cost that will eventually have to be accounted for in some way, if not publicly, then privately, in the inner lives of the children themselves as they grow and begin to understand their own story. Levin has been direct about attributing responsibility for the situation. Her view, stated clearly and without much softening, is that Harry bears significant responsibility for choices that have produced consequences for his children that he has not fully acknowledged publicly, that the narrative of protecting his family, while emotionally powerful, obscures the ways in which the choices made in the name of protection have also created genuine losses. Now, here is where I want to be careful, and where I want to be honest with you about the limits of what we know. Angela Levin has a documented perspective on Harry and Meghan that is not neutral. Her criticism of the couple has been consistent and, at times, sharp in ways that suggest something beyond dispassionate biographical analysis. Her sources within the royal household and its extended circle are people who are likely to view the Sussex departure through a particular lens. The accounts they provide to a biographer are shaped by their own relationships, loyalties, and perspectives in ways that even the most careful researcher cannot entirely correct for. All of that must sit alongside what she is saying. It does not invalidate her claims, but it contextualizes them in ways that honest reporting requires. What I find most credible in Levin's account, the part that aligns with what multiple independent observers across the spectrum of Sussex commentary have noted, is not the most dramatic element. It is the quietest one. The observation that Harry is a man navigating a profound internal tension that he has not found a public language for. The tension between the story he has told about why he left and the reality of what leaving has actually produced, between the liberation he sought and the losses that liberation has carried alongside it. That tension is not unique to Harry. Many people who make brave, necessary exits from damaging environments discover that the freedom they found is accompanied by grief they did not expect, that the place they escaped, for all its genuine harm, also contained things they valued, things that do not survive the departure intact. The negotiation of that complexity, privately and over time, is one of the harder tasks of adult life. Harry is doing that negotiation in public, under extraordinary pressure, with a media ecosystem that is incentivized to cover every stumble and every contradiction, and with two small children whose futures are, in ways both concrete and symbolic, bound up in whether he manages to find solid ground. There is something genuinely moving about that if you allow yourself to see past the noise of the coverage to the human situation underneath it. And here's where Levin's account, despite its critical framing, accidentally illuminates something important about Harry that his critics rarely acknowledge and his supporters sometimes overclaim. He is not a villain in this story. He is not a calculating operator who used his children as justification for choices made for other reasons. He is, by every credible account, a man who loves his children deeply and who made choices that he genuinely believed were in their best interest. The fact that those choices have produced complications for the children, for the family, for the broader institution, does not transform the intention into cynicism. It makes him human, fallible in the ways that parents are fallible, subject to the gap between intention and outcome that every parent who has ever made a major decision for their family's sake understands in their bones. The humiliation that Levin describes is real, in the sense that any honest reckoning with the distance between what we hoped for and what we achieved carries a quality of humiliation in it. But it is the private, internal kind, the kind that produces growth rather than spectacle, if the person experiencing it has the courage to look at it honestly. Whether Harry is looking at it honestly, whether the private reality of his family situation is producing the kind of genuine reflection that might eventually lead to a different set of choices, that is something none of us can know from the outside, and it would be dishonest to pretend otherwise. What we can observe is the public surface, the continued absence from royal events, the frozen relationship with William, the limited contact between the Sussex children and the family that shares their name and their bloodline, the ongoing negotiation between the narrative of liberation and the reality of loss. And we can observe something else, something that sits quietly at the center of the story and has never quite been addressed in all the years of coverage that have surrounded this family. The children at the heart of it, Archie, now 6, and Lilibet, now 4, did not make any of these choices. They are the inheritors of decisions made before they were old enough to have preferences, let alone agency. Whatever the rights and wrongs of those decisions, whatever the competing claims of parents and institutions and family members and biographers, Archie and Lilibet will one day be old enough to read the history of their own early years, old enough to understand the choices that were made for them, old enough to have their own views about what was gained and what was lost. That moment, when these children encountered their own story as adults with the full capacity to feel its weight, is the moment that matters most. And it is the moment that no amount of current commentary, however well-sourced or carefully framed, can fully anticipate. Angela Levin believes she is exposing something important about Harry and about the Sussex Project, and perhaps she is. Perhaps the details she has shared will prove over time to be an accurate early account of a situation whose full consequences are not yet visible. Or perhaps the story is not finished. Perhaps the frozen relationships thaw. Perhaps the distance closes in ways that none of the current coverage is positioned to predict. Perhaps Archie and Lilibet grow up with more access to their British heritage and their extended family than they currently have, because the adults around them find a way through the impasse that has so far resisted resolution. Hope is not naivety. Complexity is not confusion. And a story this human, this layered, this genuinely unresolved, it deserves to be held with more patience than the news cycle typically allows. That photograph I mentioned at the beginning, the one most people have never seen, the detail sitting in plain sight that looks different once someone points at it carefully, it is not a single image. It is the picture of a family in the middle of its own story, not at the end of it, not at the point where verdicts are appropriate or conclusions are clean. In the middle, where all the most important and most difficult human stories actually live. What do you make of it? Not the politics of it, not the allegiances, but the human question underneath all of it. What do we owe children who are born into situations they did not choose? And how do we hold the adults who made those choices accountable without losing sight of the love that, whatever else may be true, appears to have motivated them? I would genuinely love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. These are the conversations worth having, and this is the space where we try to have them properly.